Sweetheart, I promise you, by Christmas, it will just be you and me. The divorce papers are already drawn up. The sound of papers rustling came through the door, followed by the soft clink of what Sarah recognized as Richard's favorite crystal whiskey glass against his mahogany desk. Her hand instinctively moved to her still flat stomach, where a 3-week-old secret was growing. The positive pregnancy test crinkled in her sweaty palm, the same test she had planned to surprise Richard with tonight over champagne and candlelight. How naive that plan seemed now. But what about the baby? Richard, when are you going to tell her about us? Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Another baby. The words hit her like ice water, flooding her veins with a cold that had nothing to do with the October evening outside their Hampton estate. Amber was pregnant too. While Sarah had been agonizing over the perfect way to share her news, her husband's 26-year-old mistress had already beaten her to it. Sarah's been nothing but dead weight for 20 years, Richard continued, his voice taking on that cold, corporate tone she had grown to recognize over 2 decades of marriage. It was the voice he used in board meetings when he was about to fire someone, the voice that cut through emotion with surgical precision. A boring housewife who never contributed a damn thing to our success? She'll get her settlement and disappear quietly. Trust me, I know exactly how to handle her. Each word was a physical blow. 20 years of marriage. 20 years of hosting dinner parties for his clients, of moving across the country for his promotions, of putting her own dreams on hold to support his ambitions. 20 years of making herself smaller, quieter, more agreeable, until she had almost forgotten the woman she used to be, all of it dismissed as worthless, as dead weight. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the woman she had been when they met, fresh out of Wharton with her MBA, full of plans and ambitions, working 3 jobs to pay for her tiny Manhattan apartment while she built her consulting business. She had been someone then, Sarah Mitchell, not just Mrs. Richard Blackwell. When had she stopped being Sarah and become just an extension of Richard's success story? Seriously though, what if she fights it? Amber's voice carried that Valley Girl inflection that Richard had once mocked when they met her at his office Christmas party. Now, apparently, he found it charming enough to build a future around. She won't. Sarah doesn't have the spine for a real fight. She'll cry. She'll beg. But in the end, she'll take whatever I give her and be grateful for it. Richard's laughter was cold, confident. Women like Sarah always do. She's been dependent on me for so long. She wouldn't know how to survive on her own. The casual cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. This wasn't the heat of an affair or the passion of new love. This was calculated, planned, executed with the same ruthless efficiency Richard brought to his business deals. Sarah wasn't his wife in this conversation. She was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. She thought of all the times over the past year when Richard had seemed distant, distracted. All the business trips that seemed to involve more entertainment than actual business. All the evenings when he came home late, claiming to have been working with clients. How long had this been going on? How long had she been living in a marriage that existed only in her imagination? I mean, what about her family? Won't they help her? Amber's question carried genuine curiosity, as if Sarah's future was an interesting puzzle rather than a human life being dismantled. Sarah's adopted. Her parents died years ago, and she doesn't have any other family. No siblings, no close relatives. It's one of the things that made her so perfect when we got married. No complications, no interference. Richard's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had planned well. Elena Rodriguez is her only real friend, and Elena's smart enough to know which side her bread is buttered on. She won't risk her own career for Sarah. Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Elena Rodriguez, her best friend since college, the woman who had been her maid of honor, who had held her hand through her mother's funeral and her father's death. Richard was so confident that even Elena would abandon her when the chips were down. The sound of Richard's chair creaking made her step back from the door. His footsteps approached, and Sarah quickly retreated down the marble hallway, her designer heels clicking a staccato rhythm that sounded like her heart breaking in real time. She had learned to walk quietly in this house, to move through her own home like a ghost, careful not to disturb Richard's important work or important thoughts or important life. She reached the front door and paused, looking back at the house that had been her prison, disguised as a palace. The foyer stretched behind her like a museum exhibit, expensive marble, original oil paintings, fresh flowers that the housekeeper replaced twice a week, whether they needed it or not. Every surface was perfect, every detail curated to reflect Richard's success and status. But looking at it now, Sarah couldn't find a single thing that reflected her. 20 years of living in this house, and she had left no mark on it. She had been allowed to exist here, but never to belong. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "How did the pregnancy test go? I'm dying to know. Call me the second you know something." Sarah stared at the message, then at the test still clutched in her hand. She had been so excited to share this news, had imagined Elena's squeals of delight, her insistence on immediate shopping trips for baby clothes and cribs. Now the test felt like evidence of her own stupidity, proof that she had been living in a fantasy while her millionaire ex-husband planned her disposal. The irony was almost laughable. Almost. She had thought this baby would bring them closer together, might save their increasingly distant marriage. Instead, she had just discovered that Richard was already planning to leave her for a woman carrying his child. 2 pregnancies announced within minutes of each other. One wanted, one inconvenient. She opened the front door and stepped into the cool October evening. Behind her, she could hear Richard's laughter mixing with Amber's giggles, the sound of 2 people planning a future that didn't include her, the sound of her own obsolescence. For the first time in 20 years, Sarah Mitchell got in her car and drove away without leaving a note explaining where she was going, without asking permission, without considering how her absence might inconvenience anyone else. The rebellion felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The engine started with a quiet purr, a sound that had always comforted her, but that now seemed to mock the silence she had maintained for so long. As she pulled out of the circular driveway, she caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back had tears streaming down her cheeks, but there was something else in her eyes, something she hadn't seen in years. Steel. Determination. The ghost of the woman she used to be before she learned to apologize for her existence. "Well, little one," she whispered to her unborn child, her voice steady despite the tears. "Looks like it's going to be just you and me, but maybe that's exactly what we both need." The next evening found Sarah sitting across from Richard at Le Bernardin, their usual table overlooking the East River. The restaurant had always been their place where Richard had proposed 7 years into their relationship, where they celebrated promotions and anniversaries, where he conducted his most important business dinners. The maitre d' knew them by name, the sommelier kept their favorite wine in stock, and the chef always sent out a special amuse-bouche when they dined. Tonight, the familiar luxury felt like a stage set for a play she no longer wanted to perform in. Sarah had spent the day in Elena's guest room, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what she had overheard. She had replayed the conversation dozens of times, searching for some other interpretation, some way to misunderstand words that had been delivered with crystal clarity. But there was no ambiguity in what she had heard. Her husband wanted to divorce her, was already pregnant with another woman, and considered 20 years of marriage to be nothing more than an inconvenience to be resolved. The restaurant buzzed with the soft sounds of expensive dining, clinking silverware against fine china. Muted conversation punctuated by gentle laughter, the discreet pop of champagne corks. The lighting was warm and flattering, designed to make everyone look like the best version of themselves. Sarah had always loved this place, had thought Richard brought her here because it was special to them both. Now she realized he brought her here because it was public, controlled, the kind of place where emotional scenes were discouraged by the sheer weight of social expectation. Even now, planning to destroy her life, Richard was thinking strategically about optics and damage control. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something important," Richard began, straightening his tie in a gesture she had once found endearing, but now recognized as a nervous tell. His voice carried that corporate tone she had learned to dread, the voice he used when he was about to deliver bad news to employees or investors. She watched him across the table, really looking at him for what felt like the first time in years. At 48, Richard was still handsome in the way that money and good grooming could make any man attractive. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled. His suit was custom tailored. His watch was Swiss and expensive. He looked like success incarnate, like the cover of a business magazine. But looking at him now, Sarah could see the calculating coldness in his eyes, the way he assessed every situation for personal advantage, The complete absence of genuine warmth or affection when he looked at her. How had she missed it for so long? Or had she simply trained herself not to see it? Let me guess, Sarah said quietly, surprising herself with how calm her voice sounded. You want a divorce? Richard's fork paused midway to his mouth, a piece of perfectly prepared halibut forgotten. For just a moment, his carefully constructed composure slipped, and she saw genuine surprise flash across his features. Well, yes, bottom line is, Sarah, we've grown apart. You must have felt it too. The phrase bottom line made her stomach turn. Even in this moment, arguably the most personal conversation of their marriage, he couldn't stop talking like a business presentation. Their 20-year relationship was just another deal to be closed. Another problem to be solved with the right strategy and sufficient leverage. Oh, I've felt something. Richard, Sarah replied, reaching for her water glass with steady hands. The question is, when exactly did you plan to mention your pregnant girlfriend? The effect was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from Richard's face faster than she had ever seen anything happen to him. His fork clattered against his plate, and she watched him struggle to process the implications of her knowledge. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant choreography of fine dining, but their table had become an island of tension in a sea of oblivious diners. How did you, he started, then stopped, clearly running through possibilities in his mind. How much did she know? How had she found out? What did this mean for his carefully laid plans? 20 years of marriage, and you think I don't know when you're lying. Sarah reached into her purse with deliberate slowness, giving Richard time to fully appreciate what was happening. She placed the positive pregnancy test on the white tablecloth between them, the plastic stick looking stark and undeniable against the fine linen. Congratulations, Richard, you're going to be a father, just not with who you expected. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was the baby news she had planned to share with such joy and excitement, now weaponized in a conversation about the end of everything they had built together, or rather, everything she had thought they had built together. Richard stared at the test like it might suddenly disappear if he concentrated hard enough. She could see his mind working, calculating, trying to figure out how to spin this new development to his advantage. Even faced with irrefutable evidence of his wife's pregnancy, his first instinct was strategic rather than emotional. Sarah, this complicates things, he said finally, his voice carefully modulated to suggest reasonableness rather than panic. No, Richard, this simplifies everything. Sarah's voice was steady, but inside she felt like she was watching herself from a great distance, observing this conversation as if it were happening to someone else. For 20 years, I've been trying to figure out why I never felt like I was enough for you, why nothing I did ever seemed to make you happy, why I always felt like I was auditioning for a role in my own marriage. She leaned forward slightly, and Richard automatically leaned back, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the power dynamic that had governed their relationship for 2 decades. Now I know. I was never supposed to be enough. I was supposed to be small and grateful and temporary. Richard's eyes darted around the restaurant, checking to see if anyone was listening to their conversation. Even now, in this moment of personal crisis, his reputation mattered more than her pain. She wondered if he had ever truly seen her as anything more than a reflection of his own status, a well-dressed, well-behaved accessory to his success. You're being dramatic, he said, falling back on the dismissive tone he used whenever her emotions became inconvenient. Yes, I've been seeing Amber, but this doesn't have to be dramatic. Sarah repeated the word like she was tasting something bitter. I'm being dramatic because I discovered my husband is planning to divorce me for his pregnant mistress. I'm being dramatic because 20 years of marriage means I should just quietly disappear so you can start fresh with your new family. She felt something dangerous rising in her chest. Anger, but not the hot, destructive kind she had always feared. This was cold, calculating fury. The kind that made plans instead of scenes. The kind that waited for the perfect moment to strike. You called me dead weight, Richard, in your own office, to your pregnant girlfriend. Dead weight. She let the words hang in the air between them, watching him flinch at his own cruelty thrown back at him. I need to think about this very carefully. I need to really consider what 20 years of supporting your career, entertaining your clients, and sacrificing my own ambitions is worth in today's market. The phrase today's market was deliberate, a piece of his own corporate language turned against him. She watched recognition dawn in his eyes as he realized that the woman sitting across from him was not the same one who had gotten dressed for dinner that evening. Sarah, be reasonable. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Taken care of. She repeated the phrase with the same bitter precision. Like a pet you're finding a new home for. Like a problem you're outsourcing to someone else. Richard reached across the table, his hand moving toward hers in a gesture that might have been intended as comforting, but struck her as possessive. Sarah pulled her hand back before he could touch her, the movement sharp and definitive. Don't you dare touch me and pretend this is mutual. Don't you dare act like this is something that just happened to us instead of something you planned, calculated, and executed like one of your business deals. Her voice was rising slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables. Richard's jaw tightened. He hated public scenes, hated anything that might damage his carefully cultivated image as a successful, respectable businessman. Keep your voice down, he hissed. Or what, you'll divorce me? Sarah's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Oh wait, you're already planning to do that. She stood slowly, leaving the pregnancy test on the table between them like a declaration of war. Around them, other diners continued their meals, unaware that they were witnessing the end of Sarah Mitchell's old life and the birth of something new and unknown. I'll be staying at Elena's tonight, she said, her voice carrying clearly to the tables around them, despite her efforts to keep it low. Have your lawyers call mine. Sarah, wait. Richard's voice carried a note of genuine panic now. This wasn't going according to his script. In his version of this conversation, she was supposed to cry, maybe beg, certainly not turn the tables on him with evidence of her own pregnancy and the kind of steely composure he had never seen from her before. But she was already walking away, her heels clicking against the restaurant's polished floors with the same rhythm they had made when she walked away from his office door the night before. The sound of her own strength, she realized. She had been making that sound all along. She just hadn't been listening. Behind her, she heard Richard's sharp intake of breath as he processed what had just happened. The woman walking away was not the same one who had sat down to dinner. That woman, the one who apologized for her opinions, who made herself smaller to accommodate his moods, who treated his approval like oxygen was gone. In her place was someone Richard had never met, Sarah Mitchell, the woman she had been before she became Mrs. Richard Blackwell, the woman who had earned an MBA from Wharton while working 3 jobs, the woman who had built a successful consulting business before sacrificing it for his career, the woman who had enough steel in her spine to walk away from a 20-year marriage when she finally understood what it was really worth. As the restaurant door closed behind her, Sarah felt the October air hit her face like a benediction. She had just blown up her entire life, and she felt more alive than she had in years. Elena Rodriguez's office occupied a corner of the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Central Park. The space was decorated in shades of cream and gold, with law books lining mahogany shelves and original art that whispered of success earned through intelligence and determination. Elena had built this empire one case at a time, establishing herself as one of the city's most feared divorce attorneys by being smarter, tougher, and more prepared than anyone else in the room. Sarah sat in one of the leather chairs that faced Elena's desk, still processing the events of the past week, while her best friend and legal counsel reviewed the paperwork spread across the mahogany surface like battle plans. Listen here, Sarah, Elena said, leaning back in her chair with the predatory grace of someone who had never met a legal challenge she couldn't conquer. Her dark eyes flashed with the kind of anger that had made opposing counsel learn to fear her cross-examinations. That man is about to learn what happens when you mess with my best friend. But first, we need to talk about your financial situation. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in the chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Through the windows, she could see joggers making their morning rounds in Central Park, people living their uncomplicated lives while hers imploded in expensive legal consultations. How simple it must be to wake up each morning knowing exactly who you were and what you wanted. Richard handles all of that, Sarah admitted, the words tasting like failure in her mouth. I have my household account, some savings from the freelance work I did before we married, my small retirement account from my old job. She trailed off, realizing how pathetic her financial knowledge sounded. 20 years of marriage to a millionaire ex-husband, and she could barely account for their basic financial picture. Richard had always insisted that money was his domain, that she shouldn't worry her pretty head about such complicated matters. Now she understood that this hadn't been protection, it had been control. "How much do you know about Blackwell Industries' actual worth?" Elena asked, pulling out a thick folder that promised either very good news or very bad news. Given recent events, Sarah wasn't optimistic. "I know it's successful. We live well. Richard bought the Hamptons house 2 years ago for—" Sarah paused, realizing she had never actually seen the paperwork, had never been included in any financial discussions about major purchases. "I assumed it was around 2 million, maybe 3 at the most." Elena opened the folder with the deliberate precision of someone about to detonate a bomb. "Sarah, your millionaire ex-husband's company is worth over $50 million. The Hamptons house alone is worth $8.7 million. You've been living in a financial bubble, and he's been very careful to keep you there." The numbers hit Sarah like a physical blow, each digit rearranging her understanding of her own life. $50 million? She had been clipping coupons and shopping sales at Target while living in an $8 million vacation home. She had worried about grocery budgets while her husband commanded an empire worth more than small countries' GDP. The level of control, of deliberate deception, took her breath away. This wasn't just about hiding assets. This was about keeping her in a state of artificial dependence, ensuring that she never understood the true scope of what she had helped build. "But here's the thing about bubbles, sweetheart," Elena continued, spreading documents across the desk like a general planning a campaign. "They burst, and when they do, everything becomes crystal clear." "So what does this mean for the divorce settlement?" Sarah asked, though part of her was afraid to hope. Richard had seemed so confident that she would take whatever he offered, so certain that she lacked the knowledge and resources to fight him. Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. "It means that under New York law, you're entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage, including his precious company. We're talking about $25 million. Sarah, maybe more, depending on what other assets we uncover." For the first time in days, Sarah felt something like relief flooding through her system. $25 million. Enough to raise her child in comfort, enough to start over on her own terms, enough to never again depend on anyone else's assessment of her worth. Elena's plan seemed solid, practical, foolproof everything Richard's betrayal had not been. "It gets better," Elena continued, clearly enjoying the moment. "New York recognizes the concept of enhanced earning capacity. If I can prove that your unpaid labor and support significantly contributed to Richard's success, which shouldn't be hard given your background and the timing of his biggest deals, we could be looking at even more." Sarah felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth for the first time since this nightmare began. "My background. Sarah, you have an MBA from Wharton. You worked in business consulting before you married Richard. Half his early clients came through your network, and I'm willing to bet that your strategic input shaped more of his decisions than he's ever acknowledged." Elena's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had just found the perfect weapon. Financial independence for women isn't just about getting a fair settlement, it's about getting recognition for contributions that have been systematically undervalued. Elena's phone buzzed against the glass desktop, its vibration cutting through the moment of triumph. "That's my private investigator now," she said, answering with the crisp efficiency that had made her one of Manhattan's most successful attorneys. "Thomas, what did you find on Blackwell?" Sarah watched Elena's face change as she listened to whatever Thomas Chen was reporting. The confident expression that had filled Sarah with hope began to shift, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like concern. "Are you absolutely certain? When did this start? How long has this been going on?" Elena's voice carried the sharp edge it got when she sensed a case becoming more complicated than initially anticipated. Elena hung up and looked at Sarah with an expression that made her stomach drop. It was the same look doctors gave when test results came back worse than expected. The same look financial advisors wore when retirement funds had been embezzled. "Richard's been moving money offshore for 6 months, Elena said, her voice carefully controlled. "Shell companies, hidden accounts, assets transferred to entities you can't touch. Sarah, I'm afraid this divorce settlement is going to be much harder than we thought." The relief Sarah had felt moments before evaporated like water on hot concrete, replaced by a familiar sense of helplessness. Even when she thought she was finally getting ahead of Richard's manipulations, he was still 3 steps ahead of her. The 20-year pattern of her always being one move behind in a game whose rules she didn't understand was continuing even now. "How much has he hidden?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "We don't know yet, but if he's been planning this divorce for 6 months, which seems to be the case, he's had time to protect most of his assets, the house, the company stock, even your joint accounts. He could have moved everything into entities that exist only on paper in countries that don't cooperate with U.S. divorce proceedings." Sarah stared out at Central Park, watching people live their uncomplicated lives while hers became more Byzantine by the minute. The joggers didn't know they were being observed by a woman discovering that her entire existence had been a carefully constructed lie, that her husband's narcissistic abuse had been so subtle and systematic that she was only now beginning to understand its scope. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked, hearing the defeat in her own voice and hating it. Elena's smile was sharp as a blade, the expression of someone who had built her reputation by winning cases other lawyers wouldn't take. "We get creative. Richard may have had 6 months to plan, but he made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" "He underestimated his wife, and he definitely doesn't know that his wife has access to Elena Rodriguez." Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling back. For the first time since learning about Richard's betrayal, she felt like she wasn't facing this alone. Elena Rodriguez had built her reputation by finding solutions that seemed impossible until they weren't, by discovering angles that other attorneys missed, by turning legal challenges into opportunities for justice. "What's the plan?" Elena pulled out a legal pad and began sketching what looked like a military strategy. "First, we find every asset he's tried to hide. Thomas has contacts in 3 different countries and a talent for uncovering financial secrets that people think are buried. Second, we prove he's been financially abusing you throughout the marriage, controlling your access to information, restricting your financial independence, using his superior knowledge to maintain an unfair power dynamic." She paused, looking up at Sarah with eyes that had seen too many women destroyed by men who thought they were too smart to get caught. "And third, Awam, we make sure the judge understands that Richard Blackwell's narcissistic abuse extends far beyond stealing money from his pregnant wife. We're going to paint a picture of 20 years of systematic psychological manipulation." The phrase narcissistic abuse hit Sarah with unexpected force. She had never thought of Richard's behavior in clinical terms, had always assumed his controlling tendencies were just part of his driven personality, his need to manage every detail of their life together. But hearing it named, labeled, given psychological significance, it changed something fundamental in how she saw their entire relationship. "Is that what it was, abuse?" Sarah asked, the word feeling strange in her mouth when applied to her own life. Elena's expression softened, showing the compassion that made her clients trust her with their most painful secrets. "Sarah, you've been isolated from your support systems, financially controlled, and psychologically manipulated for 20 years. The fact that it was subtle, that it was wrapped in the language of love and protection, doesn't make it less real." Sarah nodded slowly, pieces of her marriage clicking into place with sickening clarity. The way Richard always knew better about everything: her clothes, her friends, her opinions. The way her suggestions were dismissed as emotional or impractical. The way she had learned to second-guess herself until she barely trusted her own thoughts. The way she had apologized for having needs, for taking up space, for existing in ways that might inconvenience his carefully orchestrated life. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. Do you think I'm strong enough for this fight? Because right now, I feel like I've been sleepwalking through my own life for 20 years, and I'm not sure I remember how to be the woman who can take on someone like Richard." Elena leaned forward, her voice fierce with conviction. "Sarah, you survived 20 years of being systematically diminished by a master manipulator, and you're still here. You walked away from that restaurant with your dignity intact. You're carrying a child and planning for their future instead of falling apart. You're not just strong enough, you're stronger than you know." She stood and moved to the window, gesturing toward the city sprawling below them. "Look out there. See all those women walking to work, building careers, making their own money 20 years ago. When Richard convinced you to give up your consulting business, how many of them do you think existed? You were ahead of your time. Sarah, you just got convinced to step backward. Sarah joined her at the window, looking down at the streams of people moving through the streets with purpose and determination. Somewhere down there were other women fighting their own battles for financial independence, for recognition, for the right to exist without apologizing. The woman who earned an MBA from Wharton while working 3 jobs didn't disappear, Elena continued. She's been sleeping, waiting for her moment to wake up. Richard's biggest mistake was thinking that woman was gone forever. As Sarah watched the city pulse with ambition and possibility below them, she felt something stirring in her chest, not just anger, but purpose. Richard had spent 20 years convinced that he had successfully transformed her into someone small and manageable. He was about to discover that transformation was not the same as destruction. The woman he had tried to erase was still there, and she was ready to remind him exactly what he had thrown away. 3 days later, Sarah sat in the pristine kitchen of the Hamptons' house, staring at her phone as Richard's voicemail played for the 3rd time. The message had arrived that morning while she was making breakfast, the first real meal she had cooked for herself in weeks. A small act of independence that felt more significant than it should have. His voice filled the kitchen with its familiar authority, the tone he used when he wanted to close a deal quickly and move on to more important matters. Sarah, my lawyers are filing the papers today. I'm being generous with the settlement offer, $500,000, and the house in Westchester. You have 48 hours to accept, or the offer gets smaller. Oh, and Sarah, don't try to claim pregnancy complications for more money. I know you're not keeping it. The casual cruelty of that last line took her breath away. The assumption that she would terminate her pregnancy rather than raise his child alone was breathtaking in its callousness. But more than that, it revealed how little he had ever known her, how completely he had missed the fundamental core of who she was. She placed her hand on her stomach, where their child was growing despite everything, and spoke aloud to the empty kitchen. Well, little one, Daddy doesn't know Mommy very well, does he? The sound of tires on gravel made her look up from her coffee. Through the kitchen window, she watched a black sedan pull into their circular driveway, followed by Richard's silver Mercedes. 2 men in expensive suits emerged from the sedan, lawyers, she assumed, based on their carefully pressed appearance and the way they moved with the confident entitlement of people accustomed to getting their way. Richard emerged from his car with Amber clinging to his arm. At 26, she was everything Sarah had once been: young, optimistic, convinced that love could conquer any obstacle. Her belly was already showing a small bump beneath her designer dress, and Sarah felt a pang of something that might have been sympathy if it weren't mixed with such bitter irony. Sarah remained seated at the kitchen island as they entered through the front door. She could hear their voices echoing through the foyer, Richard's confident baritone mixing with Amber's nervous giggles and the lawyer's professional murmurs. The sound of people conducting business, treating her life like a transaction to be completed efficiently. Sarah, Richard called out, his voice carrying that false concern he used when he wanted something. We need to talk. They found her exactly where she had been when this all started, in the kitchen, hands folded calmly in front of her, looking remarkably composed for a woman whose world had imploded over the course of a week. Amber's eyes immediately went to the granite countertops and custom cabinets, calculating their worth with the practiced eye of someone who had grown up wanting everything and getting little. These are my lawyers, Richard announced, gesturing to the 2 men flanking him like bodyguards. We're here to make this simple for everyone. Simple, Sarah repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. How many times had Richard used that word to dismiss her concerns, to shortcut conversations he didn't want to have, to make complicated emotional realities disappear through the magic of efficient problem solving, like when you made it simple to cheat on me, or simple when you hid $50 million in assets? One of the lawyers stepped forward with the kind of professional smile that cost $500 an hour. Mrs. Blackwell, we're prepared to be very generous in this unfortunate situation. It's Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying steel wrapped in silk. The correction was small but significant, a reclaiming of the identity she had held before she became Richard's wife, before she learned to define herself through his achievements and approval. And I'm not interested in your definition of generosity. Richard placed a manila folder on the kitchen island between them, the papers inside representing the end of everything they had built together. The gesture was casual, dismissive, as if 20 years of marriage could be resolved with the same efficiency as a standard business contract. 500,000, the Westchester house, and we'll cover your medical expenses through the pregnancy, he said, his tone suggesting he was doing her an enormous favor, rather than offering her less than 1% of their joint worth. Take it, Sarah. It's more than you deserve. The phrase hung in the air like a slap. More than she deserved. 20 years of marriage, of supporting his career, of sacrificing her own ambitions, of hosting his clients and managing his household and being the perfect corporate wife. And in his mind, she deserved less than the cost of one of his cars. Amber shifted uncomfortably beside him, her youth and inexperience showing in the way she couldn't quite meet Sarah's eyes. Like, Sarah, you should totally take it. 500,000 is, like, more money than most people see in their whole lives. Sarah looked at the young woman with something approaching pity. Amber had no idea what she was walking into, no understanding of the man she thought she had won. In 5 years, maybe 10, Amber would be sitting in a similar kitchen, listening to similar words, learning that the man who had promised her everything considered her worth to be whatever he decided it was worth. Amber, sweetheart, let me give you some advice, Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. When a man shows you who he really is, believe him the first time. You're about to find out what I mean. Richard's face flushed with anger, the careful composure he maintained in business settings finally cracking. Don't listen to her. Amber, Sarah's just bitter because she knows her gravy train is over. Gravy train? Sarah stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. The phrase revealed everything about how Richard saw their marriage not as a partnership, but as a charity case he had generously maintained for 20 years. Is that what you call 20 years of marriage? 20 years of building your empire while you convinced me my contributions were worthless? You never had any real dreams, Richard snapped, his mask of reasonableness finally falling away to reveal the contempt underneath. You were a struggling freelance writer when I met you. I gave you a life, a purpose, a place in society. Everything you are because of me. The words were designed to wound, to make her doubt herself the way she had doubted herself for 20 years. They were the same words he had used, in various forms, throughout their marriage, subtle reminders that she owed him her gratitude, that her existence was contingent on his approval. But something had changed in Sarah since that night outside his office door. The woman who would have crumbled under his assessment, who would have apologized for her presumption in thinking she deserved more, was gone. In her place stood someone who remembered her own worth. You're right about one thing, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. I was struggling when we met. I was 25 years old, working 3 jobs to pay for my apartment while I finished my MBA. You know, the MBA from Wharton that provided the business plan for your first major development project. The lawyers exchanged glances. This wasn't going according to Richard's script, and they clearly hadn't been briefed on their client's wife having actual credentials. You married a woman with dreams and ambitions. Richard, you just spent 20 years convincing her they didn't matter. She moved toward the kitchen window, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds that surrounded their house. Every tree, every flower, every blade of grass had been planned and maintained to create an image of success and prosperity. But looking at it now, Sarah couldn't find a single thing that reflected her own taste or preferences. Even the landscaping had been Richard's vision. This house, the company, the life you're so proud of, we built it together. But you made sure I never understood that. You made sure I thought I was just along for the ride. She turned back to face them. And for the first time, Richard seemed to recognize that the woman standing before him was not the same one who had been apologizing for her existence for 2 decades. Your generous offer is declined, she said simply. Elena will be in touch with your lawyers. Sarah, don't be stupid, Richard said. But there was something desperate in his voice now. His confidence was wavering, replaced by the uncertainty of someone whose carefully laid plans were not proceeding as expected. You'll never get more than what I'm offering. I know exactly how much you're worth, and it's not much. You know what, Richard? You're absolutely right. You do know exactly how much I'm worth. That's why you're so terrified of what happens when I figure it out. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Even Amber seemed to sense that something significant had just shifted, though she probably couldn't identify exactly what. The balance of power that had governed Sarah and Richard's relationship for 20 years was tilting, and everyone in the room could feel it. Sarah picked up the manila folder and handed it back to Richard with the kind of dignity that couldn't be bought or taught. Tell your lawyers they'll be hearing from mine very soon. And Richard, next time you want to have a conversation about my worth, make sure you're prepared for the answer. As they filed out of the kitchen, Sarah heard Amber whisper to Richard, like, is she always this scary? Richard's response was too quiet to make out, but Sarah could imagine his discomfort. For 20 years, he had been the one with all the power in their relationship, the one who made decisions, controlled information, determined what she was allowed to want or need or expect. Now, for the first time, that balance was shifting in ways he had never planned for. After they left, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the life she had thought she wanted. The house felt different now, not like a home, but like a museum of someone else's dreams, a monument to a marriage that had never really existed except in her imagination. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. How did it go with the offer? Sarah looked around the kitchen one more time, at the custom cabinets and granite countertops and professional-grade appliances that had never really been hers, that had always belonged to Richard's vision of what their life should look like. She typed back, they have no idea who they're dealing with. And for the first time in 20 years, that was exactly the truth. Because Sarah Mitchell was discovering that the woman Richard had tried to erase had never really disappeared. She had just been waiting for her moment to resurface, to reclaim the strength and intelligence and ambition that had been systematically suppressed but never destroyed. The battle was just beginning, and Sarah was finally ready to fight. Elena's choice of meeting location, a busy midtown coffee shop that hummed with the energy of ambitious people building their own empires, was deliberate. Among the laptop-wielding entrepreneurs and phone-clutching deal-makers, three people discussing a high-stakes divorce would blend into the background noise of New York's relentless pursuit of success. Thomas Chen looked nothing like Sarah's mental image of a private investigator. Instead of the grizzled ex-cop stereotype, he was a slight, impeccably dressed man in his 40s who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who specialized in uncovering secrets that powerful people thought were buried forever. His tablet looked like it could run a small country, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who saw patterns where others saw chaos. What I found is interesting, Thomas said, pulling up files on his tablet with the precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. Richard Blackwell has been very busy for the past 6 months, but so has someone else. Sarah nursed her decaf latte, her first major concession to pregnancy, while Elena spread documents across their small table, like a general planning a siege. The coffee shop around them buzzed with the sounds of people who believed they could change their circumstances through sheer force of will. Sarah had forgotten what that energy felt like until this moment. For the past 6 months, someone has been quietly purchasing shares in Blackwell Industries through a series of shell companies. Thomas continued, his voice barely audible above the espresso machine's hissing and the constant murmur of ambitious conversation. Small amounts, never enough to trigger disclosure requirements, but when you add them up, he paused, clearly enjoying the moment of revelation. 37%, just 3% shy of a controlling interest. Sarah's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. Who would do that, and why would they want to control Richard's company? That's where it gets really interesting. Thomas swiped to another screen, revealing a complex web of corporate structures that looked like a family tree designed by someone with a PhD in financial obfuscation. The money is coming from Sterling Holdings, which is owned by Sterling Real Estate Development, which is owned by Margaret Sterling. Elena's eyebrows shot up in recognition, but the name meant nothing to Sarah. She felt like she was watching a movie where everyone else understood the plot, while she was still trying to figure out who the main characters were. Never heard of her, Sarah admitted. Most people haven't, Thomas replied, pulling up what appeared to be a dossier thick enough to choke a horse. Margaret Sterling is old New York money. Very old. Her family has been in real estate since the 1800s, back when Manhattan was still farmland, and having vision meant buying swampland that would eventually become the Upper East Side. He scrolled through photographs and documents that painted a picture of generational wealth and power. She's worth approximately $200 million, owns properties in 6 countries, and sits on the boards of museums, hospitals, and foundations that most people can only dream of supporting. She's also intensely private, which makes her interest in your husband's company very curious. The implications swirled in Sarah's mind like cream in coffee, creating patterns she couldn't quite decipher. Why would a real estate mogul she had never heard of be buying shares in Richard's company during the exact same period he was planning to divorce her? What possible connection could there be between a woman worth $200 million and a housewife whose husband was trying to discard her? Thomas's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at it and smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans were coming together exactly as expected. "And she wants to meet with you, Sarah. Today." Elena's coffee cup hit the saucer with a sharp clink that echoed through their suddenly silent bubble of conversation. Why would a woman worth $200 million want to meet with a housewife going through a divorce? Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she couldn't name, but that felt as fundamental as breathing. It was the same sensation she had experienced the night she walked away from Richard's office, the feeling of stepping into a truth that had been waiting for her all along. "Maybe," Sarah said slowly, the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "Because I'm not just a housewife going through a divorce." The words surprised her as much as they surprised Elena. Where had that certainty come from? But even as she questioned it, she knew it was true. The woman she had been for 20 years, small, apologetic, dependent on Richard's approval for her sense of worth, was dissolving like sugar in water, replaced by someone she was only beginning to recognize. "There's something else," Thomas said as they gathered their things, his voice carrying the weight of information that would change everything. "I did some digging into your background, Sarah. Your adoption records were sealed, but money talks, and Margaret Sterling has enough of it to make records unsealed when she wants answers." Sarah's hands stilled on her purse, her entire body going quiet in the way that happens when the world shifts fundamentally beneath your feet. She had never thought much about her adoption, had been grateful to the Mitchells for giving her a loving home, and had never felt the need to search for her biological parents. Her adoptive parents had been wonderful, supportive, everything parents should be. The idea that there was more to her story had never occurred to her. "What are you saying?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "I'm saying Margaret Sterling specifically requested all information about any children she might have given up for adoption 45 years ago. She hired 3 different investigative firms, spent a considerable amount of money, and was very specific about the time frame." Thomas paused, clearly understanding the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Your name was the only one that came back." The coffee shop noise faded to a dull roar as Sarah processed this information. Her biological mother, a woman worth $200 million, had been looking for her, had found her, had been quietly buying shares in her husband's company during the exact same period he was planning to abandon her. The synchronicity was too perfect to be coincidence, too carefully orchestrated to be chance, which meant that somewhere in Manhattan, a woman Sarah had never met was watching her life implode and taking action to protect her. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. But even as she said it, she felt the truth of it settling into her bones like a genetic memory finally awakening. Elena's hand covered hers across the table, warm and steady and real. "Sarah, honey, nothing about your life has been what you thought it was. Why should this be any different?" As they walked out into the afternoon sunlight, Sarah felt like she was walking into an entirely different universe than the one she had inhabited that morning. The woman who had sat down for coffee was the betrayed wife of a wealthy executive, struggling to understand her worth in the aftermath of 20 years of systematic diminishment. The woman walking away was potentially the daughter of one of New York's most powerful real estate dynasties. "Are you ready for this?" Elena asked as they waited for a taxi to take them to what might be the most important meeting of Sarah's life. Sarah thought about the question seriously. Was she ready to meet the woman who had given birth to her 45 years ago? Was she ready to discover that her biological mother was wealthier and more powerful than her husband? Was she ready for her midlife transformation to include becoming an heiress to a fortune she had never known existed? "I don't think anyone's ever ready for their entire life to change in a single day," Sarah said, watching the taxi approach through Manhattan traffic. "But I'm beginning to think that maybe my entire life was supposed to change. Maybe I've been living someone else's story for so long that I forgot what my own was supposed to look like." A taxi pulled up to the curb, and as they got in, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. The woman looking back was no longer the same person who had pressed her ear to Richard's office door a week ago. That woman had been afraid of her own shadow, convinced that her worth was determined by someone else's opinion of her, terrified of taking up space in a world that seemed designed to make her disappear. This woman looked like she was ready to claim her birthright, whatever that might turn out to be. As the taxi pulled into traffic, Sarah realized that this feeling, this sense of stepping into her own power, was something she had been missing her entire adult life. Richard had convinced her that financial independence was beyond her reach, that she needed his protection and support to survive in a world too complicated for her to navigate alone. But what if he had been wrong? What if the woman sitting in this taxi was capable of things she had never imagined? What if Margaret Sterling had been waiting 45 years to help her daughter discover exactly what she was worth? The taxi merged into the flow of Manhattan traffic, carrying Sarah toward a meeting that would either destroy the last remnants of her old life or give birth to something entirely new. For the first time since learning about Richard's betrayal, she found herself hoping for destruction. Some things needed to be torn down completely before they could be rebuilt into something better. And Sarah Mitchell was finally ready to let the wrecking ball swing. The Sterling Holdings building rose from the Manhattan street like a monument to generational power, its pre-war facade speaking of money that had been accumulating interest since before the American Revolution. As Sarah stepped from the taxi, she felt underdressed in her simple black dress despite the fact that it had cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about this building whispered of a world she had never imagined belonging to a world where decisions shaped cities rather than just families. The lobby was a study in understated magnificence, marble floors that reflected century-old chandeliers, oil paintings that belonged in museums, and the kind of hushed reverence that comes from being in the presence of serious money. Sarah felt Elena's steadying hand on her elbow as they approached the reception desk, where a woman with perfect posture and pearls that probably cost more than Sarah's car greeted them with the kind of professional warmth that money could buy. "Mrs. Mitchell, Mrs. Sterling is expecting you. Please take the private elevator to the 32nd floor." The elevator music was classical, something Sarah recognized but couldn't name, the kind of refined background noise that whispered of old money and older power. When the doors opened, Sarah stepped into a world that felt like it had been designed by someone who understood that true luxury was never loud, never obvious, always confident in its own worth. Margaret Sterling's office occupied the entire top floor of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned Manhattan into a living painting spread out below. The space was decorated with antiques that had probably witnessed the signing of important documents throughout several centuries of American history, and artwork that suggested someone with both impeccable taste and unlimited resources. Margaret Sterling stood with her back to them when they entered, gazing out at Central Park through windows that offered a commanding view of the green space that served as Manhattan's breathing room. She was tall, elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a chignon that spoke of someone who had never doubted her right to command attention. When she turned, Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than sight, deeper than memory. The woman facing her had eyes the exact shade of green as Sarah's own, and when she smiled, Sarah saw her own features reflected in an older face. The same determined jawline that Richard had once said made her look stubborn. The same way of tilting her head when considering something important. The same habit of standing with one hand resting lightly on her hip when she was thinking. "My dear," Margaret said, her voice carrying decades of refinement and the kind of authority that came from never having to raise it to be heard. "You have your father's nose, but everything else is pure sterling." Sarah felt Elena's hand tighten on her elbow, steadying her as the implications of this moment settled over her like a silk shawl, beautiful, valuable, and completely unexpected. This wasn't just a business meeting or a coincidental encounter. This was a reunion 45 years in the making. "Mrs. Sterling, I think there might be some mistake," Sarah began, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "No mistake. Sarah, I've been looking for you for 45 years. Margaret moved to an antique desk that looked like it had been used to sign documents that shaped the course of American history. She picked up a silver-frame photograph with hands that shook almost imperceptibly, the only sign that this composed, powerful woman was as affected by this meeting as Sarah was. This was taken 3 days before I gave birth to you. I was 17, unmarried, and my parents were convinced it would ruin the family name. Sarah took the photograph with trembling fingers. The young woman in the picture was unmistakably her the same face, the same expression of determined optimism, even the same way of standing with one hip slightly cocked. It was like looking at herself through a window in time, seeing the woman she might have been if circumstances had been different. I've watched your life from a distance, Margaret continued, settling into a chair that had probably been crafted by someone whose name was in history books. Your adoption by the Mitchells, your education, your marriage to Richard Blackwell. I've been waiting for the right moment to make contact. Elena found her voice first, her lawyer instincts cutting through the emotional weight of the moment. And the right moment is now. Margaret's expression hardened in a way that made Sarah understand where she had inherited her own capacity for steel wrapped in silk. When this woman made decisions, they stayed made. When she chose her battles, she won them. The right moment is when my daughter needs me most. One must understand, I don't approve of men who discard pregnant wives for younger models. It shows a fundamental lack of character that I find personally offensive. The phrase women supporting women echoed in Sarah's mind as she looked between Elena and Margaret, two powerful women who had entered her life precisely when she needed them most. Was this what it felt like to have a support system that didn't require her to apologize for existing? I don't understand, Sarah said, sinking into a chair that was probably worth more than her car. Why now? Why didn't you contact me before I've lived my entire life thinking I was alone in the world except for the Mitchells? Margaret's expression softened, and for a moment, Sarah could see the 17-year-old girl who had given up her baby rather than face her family's disappointment. The vulnerability was brief but profound, a glimpse of the pain that had driven a lifetime of searching. Because before now, you didn't need me. You had built a life, made choices. Despite giving you up, I respected the woman you had become enough to believe you deserved to live your life without interference from someone who had given up the right to guide it. Her voice grew stronger, more certain. But Richard Blackwell has made this personal. The intercom on Margaret's desk buzzed softly. Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Blackwell is here for his 3 o'clock appointment. Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. You're meeting with Richard. Margaret's smile was everything Sarah had never learned to be confident, powerful, completely comfortable with her own authority. It was the smile of someone who had never apologized for taking up space, who had never doubted her right to exist exactly as she was. Perfect timing. Send him in. Elena grabbed Sarah's arm, her voice tight with concern. What's happening? What kind of meeting is this? Justice, my dear. Something that's been 45 years in the making. The sound of footsteps approaching made Sarah's heart hammer against her ribs. She had spent 20 years being afraid of Richard's disapproval, walking on eggshells to avoid his anger, shrinking herself to accommodate his moods. But sitting in this office, flanked by two women who had built empires through sheer force of will, she felt something she had never experienced before. She felt protected, not by a man who required her gratitude and submission in return, but by women who expected nothing from her except the courage to claim what was rightfully hers. Are you ready for this? Margaret asked, and Sarah realized the question wasn't about the meeting with Richard. It was about everything about accepting her birthright, about stepping into the woman she was supposed to be, about finishing her midlife transformation from victim to victor. I've been ready for 45 years, Sarah said, and she was surprised to discover that it was true. I just didn't know what I was getting ready for. The office door opened, and Richard Blackwell walked into what he thought was a business meeting, but was actually a reckoning 20 years in the making. Margaret Sterling stood behind her desk like a queen receiving a subject who had displeased her, and Sarah realized that her biological mother was about to teach her millionaire ex-husband what happened when you underestimated a sterling woman. The balance of power in the room was about to shift in ways Richard had never planned for, and Sarah was finally going to be on the winning side. Richard entered Margaret Sterling's office with his usual swagger, the confident stride of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He carried himself like success incarnate, shoulders back, chin up, the kind of physical presence that had intimidated business rivals and impressed clients for 2 decades. That confidence faltered visibly when he saw Sarah and Elena seated across from Margaret's desk like a tribunal waiting to pass judgment. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice carried none of its usual corporate smoothness. The careful modulation he used to control every conversation replaced by something raw and uncertain. The professional mask he wore so carefully was already slipping, revealing the man underneath who was used to having complete control over every situation. "Mr. Blackwell," Margaret said, not rising from her chair, her tone carrying the kind of effortless authority that came from generations of wielding real power. "Please sit down. We have a great deal to discuss." Richard's eyes darted between the three women, clearly trying to calculate what this unexpected configuration might mean for his carefully laid plans. "I'm not discussing anything with my wife present. This meeting was supposed to be confidential." Sarah watched Richard's discomfort with a detachment that surprised her. For 20 years, his anger had been her weather system, his moods the barometric pressure that determined how she moved through her days. His approval had been her oxygen, his disapproval her greatest fear. Now his frustration seemed small, manageable, entirely his problem to solve. "One must understand, Mr. Blackwell, that Sarah is no longer just your wife," Margaret said, her voice carrying the precision of someone accustomed to accuracy in all things. "She's my daughter, and as of this morning, she's also the majority shareholder in your company." The silence in the room was so complete that Sarah could hear the tick of an antique clock somewhere in the office's depths. She watched the color drain from Richard's face as the implications of Margaret's words settled over him like a net, trapping him in a reality he had never anticipated. "That's impossible. I own 70%. You own 70%, Margaret corrected with the precision of someone who dealt in facts rather than wishes. "But you've been selling shares to cover your gambling debts." "Yes, we know about Atlantic City, and the poker games at the private club on East 68th Street, and the $50,000 you lost last month alone at the underground tournament in Queens." Richard's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. Sarah felt something click into place, all those business trips that seemed to involve more entertainment than actual business. The credit card statements she wasn't allowed to see. The way Richard always seemed to need more liquid cash despite the company's apparent success. Elena leaned forward, her lawyer instincts sharp as a scalpel. "Turns out your millionaire ex-husband has been liquidating assets to cover losses you never knew about. Sarah, the offshore accounts weren't just about hiding money from you. They were about hiding the fact that there's not as much money as he claimed." The picture coming into focus was worse than Sarah had imagined. Not only had Richard been planning to leave her, he had been systematically destroying their financial security to fund a gambling addiction she had never suspected. The man who had lectured her about household budgets and questioned her grocery expenses had been throwing away tens of thousands of dollars on games of chance. "How much?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "We're still calculating the full extent," Margaret said, pulling out a folder thick with financial documents. "But it appears Mr. Blackwell has been living quite beyond his means for some time. The company is leveraged to the hilt. The properties are mortgaged multiple times over, and his personal debts exceed $2 million. The intercom crackled to life, and through the static, they could hear Amber's voice from the waiting room. She was on her phone, unaware that her conversation was being broadcast to the office where her future was being decided. "I know, Mom, but he promised me he was worth millions." "What do you mean the house is mortgaged? He said he owned it outright." "No, I haven't signed anything yet, but the baby is due in 6 months and he keeps talking about marriage." Margaret reached over and turned off the intercom with a deliberate click. "It seems your girlfriend is having second thoughts about your financial prospects, Mr. Blackwell." Sarah felt something she hadn't expected: genuine pity for Amber. The younger woman had walked into the same trap Sarah had escaped, believing Richard's carefully constructed fiction about their life together. The difference was that Amber had the benefit of Sarah's experience as a warning, even if she didn't know it yet. Richard slumped in his chair, the carefully maintained facade of success crumbling in real time. The confident executive who had dismissed Sarah as dead weight was revealed as a man whose entire empire was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. "How much do you want?" he asked, his voice carrying the defeated tone of someone who had just realized the game was over. "I don't want anything from you," Sarah said, finding her voice and her strength simultaneously. The words came from someplace deeper than anger, from a well of self-respect she had thought Richard had permanently poisoned. "But I want everything that's mine. Every share, every asset, every dollar you tried to hide." "Sarah, be reasonable. I built that company with my support, my connections, my 20 years of entertaining your clients and covering for your mistakes." Sarah interrupted, feeling power settle around her shoulders like a mantle she had always been meant to wear. "But that's not even the point anymore. Richard, the point is that you threw away a family for a woman who's already planning her exit strategy." Elena's phone buzzed against the glass table. She glanced at it and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just received confirmation of everything she suspected. "That's my accountant. The final numbers are in." She looked up at Richard with the expression of someone about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. "After debts, gambling losses, and hidden liabilities, Blackwell Industries is worth about $12 million, not 50. And that's before we factor in the lawsuits from investors who are about to discover their money has been mismanaged." The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication that her instincts about Richard's dishonesty had been correct. Sadness that 20 years of her life had been built on such an elaborate foundation of lies. 12 million, Sarah repeated, letting the reality sink in. "And how much of that is legally mine?" Margaret's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. "All of it, my dear. You see, the original capital for Blackwell Industries came from your inheritance from the Mitchell Family Trust. Money that was legally yours before you married Richard." Richard's face went gray. "That's not. The company has grown far beyond. The company has grown using my daughter's money as collateral, her social connections as networking opportunities, and her unpaid labor as a foundation," Margaret said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "In legal terms, Mr. Blackwell, you've been running a very expensive hobby with someone else's money." Elena pulled out a thick folder, the kind that contained legal documents capable of changing lives. "Richard, you have two choices. You can fight this and lose everything in a very public trial that will destroy what's left of your reputation and probably result in criminal charges for financial fraud. Or you can accept the settlement we're offering." "What settlement?" "You get to keep your pension and whatever personal assets you can prove you own before the marriage. Everything else goes to Sarah. Consider it a very generous severance package for 20 years of narcissistic abuse." Sarah watched Richard's world collapse in real time, but instead of satisfaction, she felt something unexpected: relief. Not relief that he was suffering, but relief that the truth was finally out in the open. For 20 years, she had been fighting shadows, trying to solve problems she couldn't name, failing at a game whose rules she didn't understand. Now she understood. Richard had never seen her as a partner. He had seen her as a resource to be managed, a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome. His systematic psychological manipulation had been so subtle, so carefully constructed, that she had internalized his assessment of her worth. But sitting in Margaret Sterling's office, flanked by women who had built empires through sheer force of will, Sarah finally understood her own value. She wasn't just the woman Richard was trying to discard, she was Margaret Sterling's daughter, heir to a fortune and a legacy of female strength that went back generations. "I'll need time to think about this," Richard said, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone who knew he was already defeated. "You have until 5 o'clock tomorrow," Margaret said, checking an antique watch that probably cost more than most people's cars. "After that, the offer becomes significantly less generous, and we start exploring criminal prosecution for fraud." As Richard stood to leave, his confident stride replaced by the uncertain shuffle of a man who had just discovered that his entire life was built on borrowed time and borrowed money. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years. She felt free. Free from the constant anxiety of trying to please someone who would never be pleased. Free from the exhausting work of making herself smaller to accommodate someone else's ego. Free from the prison of a marriage that had been slowly killing her spirit one dismissive comment at a time. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as Richard reached the door. "The Sterling family has decided to make a significant donation to organizations that support women leaving abusive relationships. We'll be announcing the Margaret and Sarah Sterling Foundation for Women's Financial Independence next week." Richard stopped, his hand on the door handle. Understanding that this wasn't just about his company or his money, this was about his reputation, his standing in the business community, his future ability to rebuild what he had lost. "You can't prove abuse," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Margaret's smile was gentle, almost pitying. "Richard, dear, we don't have to prove it. We just have to tell the truth about what happened. The court of public opinion is remarkably efficient at drawing its own conclusions." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Sarah felt the last 20 years of her life officially end. The woman who had walked into this office was Richard Blackwell's wife, defined by his success and dependent on his approval. The woman who would walk out was Margaret Sterling's daughter, with the resources and support to become whoever she chose to be. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah Mitchell felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 1 week later, Sarah stood in the lobby of Blackwell Industries, her hand resting protectively on her growing belly. At 20 weeks, the pregnancy was showing clearly beneath her navy blue dress, a dress that cost more than she used to spend on clothes in 6 months, purchased with her own money from her own account. The simple act of buying something expensive without asking permission had felt revolutionary. The building buzzed with the nervous energy of a company in crisis. Word had leaked about the ownership changes despite everyone's efforts at discretion, and employees whispered in clusters near the elevators, their conversations stopping abruptly when they recognized Sarah. She could feel their eyes following her as she crossed the marble lobby, trying to reconcile the woman they saw with the quiet, invisible wife who had attended company Christmas parties for 20 years. "Mrs. Blackwell." The receptionist's voice was carefully neutral, professionally polite but strained. "They're ready for you in the conference room." "It's Mrs. Mitchell," Sarah corrected gently, the distinction now feeling natural rather than forced. "And thank you." The executive conference room occupied the entire top floor of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. Sarah had been in this room dozens of times over the years, always as Richard's wife, always sitting quietly while he conducted business, always careful not to express opinions that might contradict or overshadow his authority. Today she entered as the majority shareholder of the company. The room hummed with tension as the board members filed in for the emergency meeting Richard had called. 12 men and 2 women, all of whom had benefited from Richard's leadership over the years, all of whom were now trying to calculate how this unexpected development would affect their own positions and investments. Richard sat at the head of the table, flanked by his lawyers, looking like a man who had aged a decade in 7 days. The confident executive who had dismissed her as dead weight was gone, replaced by someone who kept checking his phone and glancing toward the door as if hoping for rescue that would never come. Sarah entered with Margaret and Elena, taking seats directly across from Richard. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The 3 women faced the board like a force of nature that had finally arrived to restore balance to an ecosystem that had been off-kilter for too long. Amber was notably absent. Elena had informed them that morning that the younger woman had returned to her parents' house in Ohio, apparently deciding that the complications of Richard's life outweighed the benefits of his promised lifestyle. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for her. Amber had genuinely believed she was entering a fairy tale, only to discover she was actually the latest chapter in a cautionary tale. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice hoarse from what Sarah imagined had been a week of difficult conversations with lawyers, accountants, and creditors. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. As you know, there have been some developments regarding company ownership." The euphemism would have been funny if it hadn't represented the systematic destruction of everything they had built together. But then again, Sarah was beginning to understand that they had never really built anything together. She had built his empire while he took credit for her work and convinced her she was lucky to be included. "Let me be clear," Richard continued, trying to summon his old authority, but managing only to sound defensive. "My wife has somehow acquired a majority stake in this company through questionable means." "Point of order," Elena interrupted, her voice cutting through Richard's attempt to control the narrative like a knife through silk. Mrs. Mitchell acquired her shares through legal purchase from existing shareholders who were concerned about the company's management and hidden debts. There's nothing questionable about investors protecting their interests. Margaret stood slowly, commanding the room's attention with the effortless authority of someone born to power. Every person at the table turned toward her with the instinctive deference that people showed to real money, real influence, real consequences. Perhaps it would be helpful if I explain the situation to everyone present, Margaret said, her voice carrying across the room with the clarity of someone who had never doubted her right to speak. The murmur of conversation died as every person in the room focused on the elegant woman who radiated the kind of confidence that came from owning half of Manhattan and never having to prove it to anyone. My name is Margaret Sterling, and I am Sarah Mitchell's biological mother. For the past 6 months, I have been investigating Mr. Blackwell's business practices on behalf of my daughter, who I recently learned was facing financial abuse in her marriage. The phrase financial abuse hung in the air like an indictment. Sarah watched the faces around the table as board members began to understand that they were witnessing not just a corporate takeover, but a reckoning that had been building for 20 years. Furthermore, Margaret continued, pulling out a folder thick with documentation, our investigation has revealed that Mr. Blackwell has been systematically hiding assets, misrepresenting the company's financial position, and using corporate funds to cover personal gambling debts. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Board members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their sudden reassessment of Richard's character and judgment. Sarah could see them calculating how much money had they entrusted to someone who gambled with other people's investments. Richard's control finally snapped. This is ridiculous. He slammed his hand on the mahogany table, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Sarah is a nobody, a housewife who never worked a day in her life. She doesn't know anything about running a company. The outburst revealed everything about Richard's true nature that he had hidden behind 20 years of careful corporate diplomacy. The mask was off, and everyone in the room could see the man underneath, someone who viewed his wife not as a partner, but as an object. Someone who measured worth solely in terms of financial contribution. Someone whose narcissistic abuse extended far beyond his marriage into his professional relationships. The room fell silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would either end Richard's career or destroy his remaining credibility. Probably both. Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a blade, precise and deadly. Mr. Blackwell, you seem to have forgotten that Sarah has an MBA from Wharton, which she earned while supporting you through law school. You've also forgotten that the Mitchell Family Trust, which Sarah inherited, provided the initial capital for Blackwell Industries 20 years ago. She placed a stack of documents on the table with the deliberate precision of someone laying out evidence in a trial. Furthermore, the intellectual property for your most successful development projects came from Sarah's thesis work on sustainable urban planning, work for which she'd never received credit or compensation. Sarah watched Richard's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally, defeated recognition. Around the table, board members were processing this information with a sharp calculation of people who understood that they had been investing in a company built on someone else's foundations. But most importantly, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, you seem to have forgotten that the woman you just dismissed as worthless is sitting across from you as the majority owner of your company. I'd suggest you adjust your tone accordingly. You want the company, Richard said bitterly, his voice carrying the petulant tone of a child whose toys were being taken away. Take it. It's drowning in debt anyway. Actually, Margaret said with a slight smile that reminded Sarah of a cat who had just cornered a mouse. We don't want the company. We want justice. Elena pulled out a final folder, this one thick with documents that represented months of investigation and legal preparation. The board has 3 options. First, you can accept our restructuring plan, which includes Richard's immediate resignation and a complete audit of company finances. Second, you can fight this and watch the company collapse under the weight of Richard's debts and the publicity from a very messy trial. She paused, letting the silence build suspense while every person in the room calculated their personal exposure to Richard's poor decisions. Or third, you can accept our offer to purchase the company outright. Margaret Sterling has agreed to buy out all shareholders at fair market value and absorb the existing debts. The silence in the room was profound. Sarah realized that Margaret hadn't just been protecting her daughter's interests, she had been orchestrating a complete takeover of Richard's company while giving everyone involved a graceful exit strategy. "What happens to Richard in this scenario?" asked Janet Morrison, the only female board member besides Sarah, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who had never liked Richard's management style. Margaret's smile was razor-sharp, but not without mercy. "Mr. Blackwell will receive exactly what he gave my daughter, enough to start over, with the understanding that his previous behavior will be closely monitored by people with very long memories and very deep pockets." Sarah watched Richard process the implications. He would lose everything he had built, but unlike the settlement he had offered her, he would be left with enough to survive. It was more generous than he deserved, and they all knew it. "I need time to consider," Richard began. "No," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority she had never heard from herself before. The word came from somewhere deep in her chest, from a place that had been silent for 20 years, but was now ready to speak. "You've had 20 years to consider how you treat people. Time's up." The silence that followed was electric. Every person in the room understood that something fundamental had just shifted, that the quiet woman who had sat in the corner at company events had just claimed her rightful place at the center of the conversation. The vote was unanimous. Richard Blackwell's empire, built on his wife's money and sustained by her unpaid labor, officially became the property of Margaret Sterling and her daughter. As the board members filed out, shaking hands and making their diplomatic exits, each one stopped to introduce themselves to Sarah as if meeting her for the first time. In many ways, the woman they had known as Richard's wife had been a performance, a role she had played so convincingly that she had almost convinced herself it was real. This woman, Margaret Sterling's daughter, the majority shareholder of a multi-million-dollar company, someone who spoke with quiet authority and commanded respect through competence rather than fear, was who she had always been underneath the layers of conditioning and control. Richard remained seated as the room emptied, staring at the table where he had once commanded absolute authority. When he finally looked up at Sarah, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before: recognition. For the first time in their 20-year marriage, Richard Blackwell was seeing his wife clearly. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "No," Sarah replied, standing slowly and gathering her things with the deliberate grace of someone who had just reclaimed her own life. "You saw exactly who I was. You just thought you could make me forget." As she walked toward the door, Richard called after her, "Sarah, what happens now?" She paused at the threshold, looking back at the man who had shaped 20 years of her life, who had convinced her she was small and grateful and temporary. He looked smaller now, diminished by the revelation of his own failures and limitations. "Now," Sarah smiled, feeling her daughter kick against her ribs as if in approval. "Now I become who I was always supposed to be." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Sarah walked out of Blackwell Industries for the last time as anyone other than its owner. 2 months later, Sarah stood on the terrace of Margaret's Central Park West penthouse, her hand resting on her now prominent belly as Manhattan glittered like a circuit board of dreams and ambitions spread out 40 floors below. The dissolution of Blackwell Industries had been swift and decisive, but the real transformation had been quieter. More personal, the gradual rebuilding of a woman who had forgotten she was allowed to take up space in the world. The November air was crisp but not quite cold, carrying the scent of autumn leaves from Central Park and the eternal energy of a city that never stopped believing in the possibility of reinvention. Sarah wore a cashmere coat that had cost more than she used to spend on clothes in a year, purchased without asking anyone's permission or considering anyone else's opinion about whether she deserved such luxury. "Penny for your thoughts." My dear Margaret joined her at the marble railing, offering a glass of sparkling cider that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. The view from the 35th floor turned Manhattan into a living map of human ambition. Sarah could see people moving through the streets below like blood cells through arteries, each one carrying their own dreams, their own struggles, their own stories of triumph and defeat. A year ago, she had been one of those anonymous figures, invisible even to herself. "I keep thinking about something Amber said that night at the restaurant," Sarah replied, accepting the crystal glass and feeling the weight of it in her hands, substantial, valuable, real. About 500,000 being more money than most people see in their lifetime. Margaret raised an eyebrow, waiting for Sarah to continue. She had learned that her daughter thought carefully before speaking, weighing her words the way someone who had been systematically silenced learns to do. She wasn't wrong about the money, Sarah continued, watching a helicopter cross the sky like a mechanical bird carrying someone to their next important meeting. But she missed the point entirely. It was never about the amount. It was about 20 years of my life that Richard dismissed as worthless. The sound of the elevator arriving interrupted their conversation. Elena emerged onto the terrace, slightly out of breath but carrying a bottle of champagne and a thick folder that Sarah had learned to associate with very good news. "Sorry I'm late," Elena announced, settling into one of the comfortable chairs that furnished the terrace, like an outdoor living room designed for people who never had to worry about weather or budget constraints. "Traffic was murder, and I had to stop by the office for these final documents." She set the champagne on the glass table and opened the folder with the satisfaction of someone who had just closed the most rewarding case of her career. "I have news that's going to make your day. The final asset distribution is complete," Elena announced, pulling out documents that represented the official end of Sarah's old life and the beginning of something entirely new. "Sarah, you now own the Hamptons house free and clear, plus $12.7 million in liquid assets after all debts were settled and legal fees were paid." The number still seemed impossible to Sarah. $12.7 million. Enough for her daughter to attend any college she chose, to start any business that caught her imagination, to never depend on anyone else's assessment of her worth. It was financial independence beyond anything she had dared to dream when she was clipping coupons and shopping sales while married to a man worth $50 million. "And Richard?" Sarah asked, though she found she was asking more out of curiosity than concern. Elena's expression became carefully neutral, the way lawyers look when they're about to deliver news that could be interpreted as either justice or cruelty. "Richard gets to keep his pension in the Westchester house, which is actually underwater on its mortgage. Turns out he refinanced it 3 times to cover gambling debts. He'll also face ongoing monitoring from the State Gaming Commission and several civil suits from investors who feel misled about the company's financial health." Margaret sipped her champagne thoughtfully, her eyes fixed on Central Park, where families were enjoying the last warm afternoon before winter settled over the city. "And Miss Hayes?" Elena's grin turned predatory, the expression of someone who took professional satisfaction in seeing karma work its magic with mathematical precision. "Amber filed for palimony 2 weeks ago. Apparently, she discovered that Richard's gambling problem extends to offshore poker tournaments and private games with stakes that would make most people dizzy. She's seeking support for herself and the baby, plus damages for what her lawyer is calling intentional emotional distress through financial misrepresentation." Sarah's laughter surprised her genuine, free, the sound of someone who had finally learned to find humor in life's ironies instead of being crushed by them. The image of Richard facing multiple legal challenges from women he had underestimated was almost too perfect to be believable. "You know what the strangest part is," Sarah said, looking out over the city that had become her kingdom instead of her prison. "I actually feel sorry for him. He had everything: a family, a successful business, a future that could have been anything he wanted it to be, and he threw it all away for the illusion of something better." Her phone buzzed against the glass table where she had placed it. Richard's name appeared on the screen for what felt like the 100th time in the past week. He had been calling every day, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that she had stopped listening to after the first few revealed nothing but self-pity and attempts at manipulation. "Are you going to answer?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Actually, yes. I think it's time for our final conversation." Sarah picked up the phone with hands that no longer trembled when Richard's name appeared on her screen. Elena and Margaret's supportive presence felt like armor around her shoulders. Protection not just from his words but from her own long-conditioned responses to his moods and manipulations. "Hello, Richard. Sarah, please." His voice sounded smaller through the phone, stripped of the authority she had learned to fear and respect. "I know I made mistakes, but we can work this out. I'll give up gambling, go to counseling, whatever you want. We built a life together." Sarah looked out over Central Park, where joggers and dog walkers and tourists moved through their lives, most of them unaware that they were being observed by a woman who had just learned the difference between love and control, between partnership and possession. "Richard, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice calm and certain in a way it had never been during their marriage. "This isn't about punishment or revenge. This is about me finally recognizing my own worth. But we had 20 years together." "No, Richard, you had 20 years, and I supported them while you slowly convinced me I had nothing to contribute. But I'm done being small to make you feel big." The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Sarah to count her own heartbeats, to feel her daughter moving inside her, to understand that she was speaking not just for herself, but for the next generation of women who would never have to choose between love and self-respect. "Think about the baby, Sarah. Think about our baby." Sarah's hand moved protectively to her belly, where her daughter was growing strong and healthy, surrounded by the love of women who understood that female strength was not a threat to be contained, but a force to be celebrated and nurtured. "I am thinking about our baby. Richard, I'm thinking about raising a child who will never doubt their worth because one parent decided they weren't enough." This was the moment she had been building towards since that night outside Richard's office door, the culmination of her midlife transformation from victim to victor. Every conversation, every legal meeting, every moment of doubt had led to this clarity. 20 years ago, you married Sarah Mitchell, a woman with dreams and ambitions and intelligence that could have built empires. You spent 2 decades systematically making her forget who she was, convincing her that she was lucky to exist in the margins of your life. The silence on the other end of the line was complete. Sarah could almost hear Richard processing the implications, understanding for the first time that the woman he had dismissed as dead weight had been the foundation holding up his entire world. "But you never married the real me, Richard. You married the version of me that was willing to disappear. The version that apologized for having opinions, for taking up space, for needing more than you were willing to give." Her voice grew stronger with each word, carrying the authority of someone who had finally learned to speak her own truth without apology or qualification. "I'm not disappearing anymore. I'm not shrinking to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. I'm not grateful for crumbs when I helped bake the whole loaf. Sarah, I'm done, Richard. We're done. Not because I'm angry, but because I've finally remembered who I am." She hung up the phone and placed it face down on the table, feeling the weight of 20 years of silence lift from her shoulders like a physical burden being removed. Around her, the city continued its eternal dance of ambition and hope, and for the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt like she belonged to it instead of being conquered by it. Elena raised her champagne glass in a toast, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just helped justice prevail against long odds. "To women who refuse to disappear." Margaret lifted her glass with the grace of someone born to celebrate victories, both her own and those of the people she loved. "To daughters who finally come home." Sarah raised her sparkling cider, feeling her daughter kick against her ribs as if in approval of this moment, this decision, this declaration of independence that had been 45 years in the making. "To new beginnings," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The glasses clinked together with the crystalline sound of expensive crystal and expensive freedom, while below them, Manhattan glittered like a promise that anything was possible for women brave enough to claim their own power. As the sun set over Central Park, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed designed for moments of triumph, Sarah felt something settle into her bones that she had never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the people who were supposed to be in her life, building exactly the future she was meant to create. The woman who had pressed her ear to Richard's office door in desperation was gone forever, replaced by someone who would never again apologize for her own existence. 6 months later, Sarah pushed her baby stroller through Central Park on a perfect spring morning, stopping at their favorite bench overlooking the pond where children sailed model boats and couples shared ice cream, and life continued its eternal dance of ordinary magic. At 3 months old, Emma Margaret Mitchell had her grandmother's steady gaze and her mother's determined chin, and she studied the world with the intense focus of someone already making plans for how she might improve it. The April afternoon was everything spring in New York should be: warm, but not too warm, with the kind of gentle breeze that made the city feel like the center of the universe instead of just another collection of buildings full of people chasing their dreams. Sarah had learned to treasure these moments of peace, these pockets of contentment that had been so rare in her old life. "Your grandmother says you're going to be trouble, little one," Sarah said softly, adjusting Emma's blanket with the practiced efficiency of someone who had discovered that motherhood was just another form of strength. "Strong-willed women usually are." The sound of running footsteps made her look up from her daughter's face. Elena jogged toward them, slightly out of breath but glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had just finished a particularly good workout. At 52, Elena moved with the confidence of someone who had never apologized for taking up space in the world, who had built her life according to her own specifications rather than anyone else's expectations. "How's our little Mogul doing today?" Elena asked, dropping onto the bench beside them and immediately reaching for Emma, who responded with the kind of delighted gurgling that made adults feel like they had accomplished something important just by existing in her presence. "Planning her empire, apparently," Sarah replied, watching Elena hold her daughter with the natural ease of someone who understood that babies were just small people with big potential. She spent an hour this morning staring at the financial reports like she was memorizing them for future reference. Elena's laughter carried across the pond, mixing with the sounds of children playing and dogs barking and life happening in all its messy, wonderful complexity. "Speaking of empires, the Mitchell Foundation board meeting is next week. Are you ready to present the expansion plans?" Sarah considered the question as she watched a young couple argue near the pond. The woman's body language was heartbreakingly familiar, smaller, apologetic, trying to take up less space while her boyfriend gestured dismissively. Sarah wanted to walk over and tell her that she deserved better, that love should make you bigger rather than smaller, but she had learned that wisdom couldn't be shared until someone was ready to receive it. The Mitchell Foundation, established with her inheritance from Richard's company assets, had started as a simple idea: provide business loans and mentorship to women leaving abusive relationships. In 6 months, it had grown into something larger, more comprehensive, a network of support that addressed everything from financial independence to legal resources to psychological counseling. "I think so," Sarah said, feeling the familiar flutter of excitement that came with building something meaningful. "Margaret says the key to success is surrounding yourself with people who believe in your vision." "And what is your vision?" Elena asked, settling Emma more comfortably in her arms while the baby continued her serious study of the world around her. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the young woman by the pond make herself smaller in response to her boyfriend's criticism. The sight triggered memories that were still fresh enough to sting memories of her own voice getting quieter over the years, her own opinions becoming more tentative, her own dreams shrinking to fit into the space Richard allowed her to occupy. "I want to make sure no woman has to wait until she's 45 to discover who she really is," Sarah said, the words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I want financial independence for women to be the norm, not the exception. I want young women to grow up knowing that they never have to choose between love and self-respect." Elena's phone buzzed with a news alert. She glanced at it and shook her head with the expression of someone who had seen this story too many times before. Richard made the news again. Apparently, his new business venture failed spectacularly. Something about poor financial planning and investor fraud allegations. Sarah felt the familiar pang of something that might have been sympathy if she hadn't learned to protect herself from the urge to rescue people who didn't want to be saved. "Is he okay?" "Financially, not remotely. The gambling addiction got worse after the divorce, and his attempts to start over have been disasters. Amber left him when the money ran out, and now she's seeking full custody of their son plus additional child support." Elena's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering news that was predictable but still unfortunate. "But Sarah, you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." Emma made happy baby sounds, reaching toward a pigeon that had landed near their bench with the fearless curiosity of someone who had never learned to doubt her welcome in the world. Sarah lifted her daughter from Elena's arms, holding her against her chest and feeling the solid weight of this new life that had emerged from the ashes of her old one. "I used to think love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger," Sarah said, watching the pigeon hop closer as if drawn by Emma's obvious delight. "Now I know that real love grows when both people become more themselves, not less." The sound of heels clicking on the path announced Margaret's arrival. At 72, she walked with the purposeful stride that had built a real estate empire and showed no signs of slowing down. She carried herself like someone who had never questioned her right to exist, who had never spent a single day of her life apologizing for taking up space in a world that belonged as much to her as to anyone else. "My two favorite ladies," Margaret said, settling onto the bench with the grace of someone who had been sitting in expensive furniture her entire life, but had never forgotten what it felt like to earn comfort rather than inherit it. "How was the meeting with the architect?" "The new Women's Center will be beautiful," Sarah replied, feeling the satisfaction that came with building something meaningful instead of just maintaining someone else's vision. "Bright, open, designed to make people feel empowered instead of like charity cases." Margaret nodded approvingly. She had taught Sarah that architecture told people who they were supposed to be when they entered a space, and they wanted their clients to feel capable from the moment they walked through the door. Every detail of the center had been planned to communicate strength, possibility, and the fundamental belief that every woman deserved the chance to rebuild her life on her own terms. Emma began babbling in the serious tone that babies use when they have important things to communicate to the adults in their lives. Sarah looked down at her daughter, who was reaching toward the sky with tiny, determined fists, and felt something click into place, a sense of completion that had nothing to do with having enough money or the right address, and everything to do with finally understanding her own purpose. "She's trying to tell us something," Elena observed, watching Emma's animated gestures with the fascination of someone who had never quite believed that such tiny humans could have such strong opinions about everything. Sarah studied her daughter's face, seeing her own features reflected in miniature, but also something entirely new, a combination of sterling determination and Mitchell kindness that would hopefully serve Emma better than either trait alone. But more than that, she saw someone who would grow up never doubting her right to take up space, never apologizing for having opinions, never making herself smaller to accommodate someone else's ego. "I think she's saying she's ready to take on the world," Sarah said, and realized she was describing not just her daughter, but herself. As the afternoon sun filtered through the spring leaves, casting dancing shadows on the path where other families walked and played and lived their complicated, beautiful lives. Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she had been a woman who apologized for existing. Now she was a mother, a philanthropist, and a daughter who had found her way home to a family she never knew existed. Margaret's voice carried the warmth of shared memory and the satisfaction of someone who had finally found what she had been searching for her entire life. "You know, Sarah, when I gave you up for adoption 45 years ago, I told myself it was because I couldn't give you the life you deserved. I was wrong. I couldn't give you the life I thought you should have, but you created the life you were meant to live." Sarah shifted Emma to her shoulder, feeling the trust in her daughter's relaxed weight and understanding that this moment of perfect clarity about who she was and what she wanted was worth more than all the money in her accounts or all the property in her name. "Richard did me a favor, in the end," Sarah said, surprising herself with the complete absence of bitterness in her voice. "He forced me to choose between the life I was living and the life I wanted to live. I just wish it hadn't taken me 20 years to realize I had a choice." The fountain in the distance played its eternal song while children's laughter mixed with the sounds of the city, continuing its ancient dance of ambition and hope. Sarah felt Elena's friendship, Margaret's love, and Emma's trust settling around her like a cloak of belonging that no one could ever take away. "What do you think she'll be when she grows up?" Margaret asked, watching Emma study the Manhattan skyline like she was calculating its possibilities and finding them satisfactory. Sarah looked down at her daughter, who was gazing at the world with the intensity of someone already making plans for how she might leave it better than she found it. In Emma's eyes, she saw not just her own reflection, but the reflection of all the women who had come before, and all the women who would come after, a continuous chain of strength that had been temporarily hidden but never broken. "Whatever she wants to be," Sarah said with absolute certainty. "But more importantly, she'll know she has the choice." The church bells in the distance marked the hour while the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed designed for moments of triumph. Sarah stood slowly, settling Emma back in her stroller with the easy confidence of someone who had learned that competence was just another form of love. "Ready to go home," Little one. As they walked back toward Fifth Avenue, Sarah caught her reflection in a shop window and barely recognized the woman looking back. Gone was the apologetic posture, the careful smile, the way of moving through the world as if she were constantly asking permission to exist. In her place was someone who took up exactly the amount of space she needed, who spoke with quiet authority, who commanded respect through competence rather than compliance. Behind her, Margaret walked with the satisfaction of a woman who had finally solved the puzzle she had been working on for 45 years. Beside her, Elena moved with the easy confidence of someone who had helped justice prevail and would continue to do so for as long as she drew breath. And in the stroller, Emma slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams come to babies who are born into families that believe in their limitless potential, who will grow up surrounded by women who understand that female strength is not a threat to be contained, but a force to be celebrated and nurtured and passed down through generations. The city continued its eternal rhythm around them, millions of people writing their own stories, making their own choices, discovering their own worth. Sarah was just one of them now, no longer invisible, no longer apologizing for her existence, no longer waiting for permission to live her own life. She was finally, completely, unapologetically herself. And that, she realized as they walked toward home through the city, that had always been hers but that she was only now learning to claim, was worth more than all the money in the world. The woman who had pressed her ear to Richard's office door in desperation was gone forever, replaced by someone who would teach her daughter that love multiplies when you refuse to make yourself smaller, that financial independence is just another form of freedom, and that the most radical thing a woman can do is simply refuse to disappear. As the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in colors that seemed designed for new beginnings, Sarah Mitchell walked toward her future with her head held high and her daughter in her arms, finally understanding that this moment of complete certainty about who she was and what she was worth was what victory looked like. Not the destruction of her enemies, but the construction of her own life according to her own specifications. Not revenge against those who had tried to diminish her, but the radical act of refusing to stay diminished. The story that had begun with betrayal and heartbreak ended with something much more powerful, the sound of a woman claiming her own life, one confident step at a time.